let me introduce Zachary Bishop. He's a historian and museum professional whose current research focuses on the history of Kane and DuPage Counties. He earned his master's degree in history from Northern Illinois University and has worked at the Downers Grove Museum and DuPage County Historical Museum. He is currently the collections registrar and a museum studies instructor at Shingothi Center of Aurora University. And Zach is working on projects about the history of the Underground Railroad, housing discrimination, and the LGBTQ community in the area. So thank you so much for being here, Zach. I'll hand it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really wanted to give this presentation in September specifically because September is International Underground Railroad Month. This holiday month was created by the state of Maryland in 2019, and other states have also declared it as a holiday as well. And they chose the month of September because it is the month that two of the most famous Underground Railroad participants, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, escaped from slavery. Before I begin, I just would like to thank there you go. Just wanted to thank some people who helped make this presentation possible. Thank you so much to Colleen and the Aurora Public Library for having me. Michael Fichtel and the Aurora Historical Society, who provided me with a lot of great resources from the Society's archives. Jake Dean from Blackberry Farm for providing me some great information about the Wagner family. And Dennis Buck, whose book, From Slavery to Glory, African Americans Come to Aurora, was a really helpful resource in my research. And then also to, of course, Glenette Tilly Turner, who is an Underground Railroad historian and author who her work has really just inspired a lot of my research, and really a lot of the reason we know so much about the Underground Railroad in the suburbs is because of her. So I just want to share briefly kind of how I got into Underground Railroad history and research. So in 2017, I became the curator of the Downers Grove Museum, which owns an 1840 structure known as the Israel and Avis Blodgett House. When I arrived, there was kind of a local debate over whether or not there was historical proof that the Blodgetts were involved in this movement. And so I started to kind of do my own research and quickly found a ton of credible evidence to show that the Blodgetts were indeed historically involved in the movement. And because of this experience, I started kind of expanding my scope outward. I started on DuPage County, looking at the history there. And then more recently, I have started to look at Kane County too, because I realized just how intertwined the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad war with both of these counties together. And so given that I live in Aurora, Aurora was a good place to start researching in Kane County. And then also more recently in 2023, I helped nominate the Blodgett House to the National Park Service's National Network to Freedom, which is basically a network of verified Underground Railroad sites across the country. It's a really great resource. There's not a ton of sites in Kane and DuPage counties, and I'm hoping to start to change that as I move forward. So I wanted to start talking about this topic with a really interesting story that I came across in my research. So sometime around 1850, members of the First Congregational Church of Aurora received word from Underground Railroad conductors south in Ottawa, Illinois, that a group of enslaved people seeking their freedom were headed to Aurora with their master in hot pursuit. The church's members hid a group of 4 to 5 of these freedom seekers when they arrived in Aurora. Later, when their master came along after them, Aurora residents refused to aid him in his search or be hired as guards. So the master continued on to Naperville and hired men to stand watch for his slaves there. The members of First Congregational were scared of transporting these individuals to Chicago because of these men at Naperville, so their pastor, Reverend David Miller, devised his own plan. Miller borrowed a covered wagon and acquired 2 horses. In the back of the wagon, he hid the men in the group under blankets. Miller then had his wife, Jane, and the one enslaved woman in the group dressed the same, both wearing black veils, and had them sit in the front seat together. At 11 p.m., they left Aurora and were stopped by the slaveholders' hired men in Naperville as expected. They asked Jane Miller to lift her veil, and they saw that she was white, and they decided that they weren't going to search further, and they let the wagon pass. And so the Millers then successfully brought the freedom seekers to Chicago, where they were able to board a ship to Michigan. As the story illustrates, before the Civil War, Aurora was a hub for both abolitionism, which was the movement to abolish slavery, and the Underground Railroad, which were the efforts of enslaved Black Americans to obtain their freedom through escape. The belief that members of the abolitionist movement held, predominantly the belief that slavery was immoral and sinful, is what led abolitionists to advocate for the end of slavery in political, community, and religious arenas. Some abolitionists went a step further and defied the law to directly aid the individuals escaping freedom on the underground or escaping slavery on the Underground Railroad and help them reach freedom in Canada. The members of the First Congregational Church of Aurora played a leading role in making Aurora a safe haven for anti-slavery activism and the Underground Railroad. But numerous other citizens were also integral in these efforts. So I'm going to spend the first part of my presentation talking about how Aurora was a center for abolitionism, and then move into how Aurora participated in the Underground Railroad. So just a little background on the abolition movement. So abolitionism was an interracial, international movement to end slavery. Both free and enslaved Black Americans, as well as white Americans, participated in the movement and contributed to its goals and prevailing beliefs. Abolitionists also fought against slavery around the world in the United States, Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. The abolition movement was really rooted in enslaved individuals' desire to be free and their resistance to slavery. Enslaved people resisted slavery by escaping, suing for their freedom, leading slave rebellions, and other methods. And this resistance is what inspired the beginning of abolitionism in the colonial era. The resistance continued to influence abolitionists into the 19th century. Specifically, it would influence why abolitionists believed that abolition was a just cause, how they advocated for the end of slavery, and the urgency with which they approached the work. Escaped and formerly enslaved individuals who resisted by speaking out against slavery and sharing their personal stories played a pivotal role in the spread of abolitionist beliefs. They were also driven by other factors. So they believed that all people, regardless of their race, had certain civil liberties that should not be violated. So this is the idea that's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. They also believed that slavery was a crime against God. They drew on various passages of the Bible to support this argument, especially the idea of universal brotherhood espoused by Jesus. So you may remember he said, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me," and also love your neighbor as yourself. Another big factor was pro-slavery violence. And this was pro-slavery violence because individuals who were really in support of slavery often violently attacked vocal abolitionists. For example, there was an abolitionist named Elijah Lovejoy who was murdered by a mob in Alton, Illinois, for publishing an anti-slavery newspaper. Such attacks caused abolitionists to double down on their beliefs and see slavery as truly an evil force. So abolition, activism, and organizing was mostly centered on the East Coast in the 19th century. So how did it spread to Aurora and Illinois? Well, Aurora's first American settlers were predominantly from New England and New York, which were hotbeds of abolitionist activism and religious revivals in the 19th century, which were both very intertwined. Aurora was also established in the mid-1930s, which was when abolitionists began to argue that slavery needed to be abolished immediately, not sometime in the future. And it was also a time when the movement was growing substantially and becoming more energized. And it was in Abolitionist newspapers and societies were also springing up all over the country at this time, so settlers to Aurora would have been aware of the movement and could have possibly already aligned themselves with it before moving west. And then Aurorans further learned about the movement and became involved with it through abolitionist newspapers they subscribed to, circuit speakers who traveled to Aurora and surrounding areas to speak, and various anti-slavery meetings that were organized by ardent abolitionists in Illinois. The Western Citizen, which I have a picture here, or a picture of one of the issues, was a predominant abolitionist newspaper published in Chicago that many Aurora residents subscribed to. And we know this because the original subscription books are in the collection of the Chicago History Museum. This newspaper shared abolitionist articles and also notices of anti-slavery meetings and speakers. So it was really a great way for people who wanted to get in the vault. It really was a great way for people to learn how to get involved in the movement. And the noble goals of the abolitionist movement particularly swayed the members of Aurora's First Congregational Church, and they became highly involved in the movement, often hosting abolitionist meetings and speakers. So First Congregational was originally founded as the First Presbyterian Church of Aurora in June 1838, only a couple years after Aurora was established. It was the second church founded in Aurora after the Methodist Church. And after 3 years of meeting in private homes and the schoolhouse, they finally built their own church building on West Park Place, across from McCarty Park on the east side of Aurora. Their building was actually the first church building in Aurora because the Methodists had yet to build theirs yet. And this photo is actually a picture of the original church building when it housed Garby Iron Works in 1919. So it was later moved, after it was used as a church, it was moved to a lot on Water Street in about 1880 and was later demolished in 1934. It was a pretty simple building made out of logs with a footprint of about 30 by 40 feet. And for many years, it was really the only auditorium that was large enough to host big meetings in town. So it was a really important meeting place in Aurora. So First Congregational would use this building until about 1856 when they built their new building, which was their long-standing church on the other side of McCarty Park. The church then sold the old building to the Union Baptist Church, which later renamed itself Park Place Baptist Church. And just to kind of give you an idea of where the church was located, so this is a map showing its original location, and this is actually what the church building looked like in 1867 after Park Place Baptist Church moved in. And this is where in Aurora the important abolitionist meetings were held. Today, the lot that the church building was on is next to Warehouse Church, and it has this house on it, and the property is actually owned by the city of Aurora. So this was the second site of First Congregational Church, the building that they built in 1856. So they really just kind of moved across McCarty Park to the corner of Galena and East Park Place. The building itself, they used it until about 1968, and the building has since been demolished. So now it's just kind of the corner of the grocery store. So First Congregational Church had a series of abolitionist preachers, beginning with a man named J. Halleck from the East Coast in 1843. And these preachers really helped open the congregation eyes to slavery and its moral complications. In 1844, so just 6 years after they founded, the church's congregation decided to take a stance on the issue. So in January 1843, the church unanimously resolved that, quote, "We hold no fellowship with slavery or oppression, and that they consider themselves an anti-slavery church." They further resolved that the church should not, quote, "invite nor encourage any slave dealer or owner or any person who will advocate the principle of slavery to our pulpits." So with this resolution, the church's members demonstrated that they were strongly opposed to slavery and that they didn't want anyone, to the point that they didn't want anyone involved with it or supportive of it to speak in their church. And siding with abolitionism was a pretty bold act for such a small church to make in this time period. Around this time, abolition was considered to be a very radical political movement that only a small minority of the country supported. A lot of people considered abolitionists to be irrational and their ideas dangerous, especially people who were supportive of slavery in the South. And I've even heard some scholars make the comparison that Americans in the 1800s thought abolitionism was as radical of a movement as Americans thought communism was in the 1950s. And so a couple years after this, First Congregational Church would double down on their support. And in July of 1848, they resolved to leave the Presbyterian Church because of its stance on slavery. They then switched to Congregationalism. And this was actually something that a lot of Presbyterian churches in Northeastern Illinois were doing at the time. And this was really because they thought that national Presbyterian church leaders were not taking a strong enough stance against slavery because they had yet to forbid slave owners from being members of all Presbyterian churches. First Congregational held many important abolitionist meetings, but perhaps one of the most significant was the State Convention of Illinois' Liberty Party. So the church held it in January of 1844, so a little over a week after making their anti-slavery resolution. The Liberty Party was a national political party founded by abolitionists in 1840 who believed that abolitionists needed to fight to end slavery through the political system. The party would not have a ton of success in electing candidates, but it was vital because it organized abolitionists politically across the country and would eventually lead to the creation of the Republican Party. In January of 1844, the Liberty Party chose First Congregational Church, then still called First Presbyterian, as the location for its state convention, which brought about 100 abolitionists from 9 counties across the state. This was a big undertaking for such a small town because they had to house all these individuals for the 2 days of the convention. But the Liberty Party delegates really accomplished a lot of this convention. They chose Illinois' choice for the party's presidential and vice presidential candidates, as well as candidates for Congress. They developed a plan to grow the party in Illinois. They debated and vote on which policies related to abolitionism to support. And they even voted to send a letter to Congress protesting the arrest of free Black people mistaken to be fugitive slaves in Washington, D.C. So they got quite a lot done. And one attendee to the convention wrote that First Congregational Church was overflowing with people. This writer said, "The commodious church was literally crowded, seats, aisles, pulpit, stairs, and all. All those who attended the convention left energized to fight slavery after being in this convention together." And another important aspect of this conference was that it allowed abolitionists in Kane County to connect with those in other parts of the state, which would help establish the network that was vital for promoting abolitionism and later aiding enslaved people in escaping on the Underground Railroad. One other important meeting that I'll talk about was a meeting held at First Congregational Church a decade later on September 20th of 1854. The meeting was a convention called by, quote, the people, who were a group of 207 Illinois residents who strongly disagreed with the recent passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act by pro-slavery Democrats in Congress. This act was significant because it repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery in new territories and states north of the Mason-Dixon line. And it also allowed for the Kansas and Nebraska territories newly created and potentially future territories and state to organize as slave states. The law also led to a wave of violence in Kansas and Nebraska as pro and anti-slavery settlers rushed into the territories to try to organize these territories as free or slave states, depending on their beliefs. Abolitionists were, of course, against the bill because it expanded slavery, but there were also many members of the 2 major political parties at the time, the Democrats and the Whigs in Illinois, who did not necessarily agree that who were against the Kansas-Nebraska bill. They didn't necessarily agree that slavery should be abolished immediately, but they did agree that slavery shouldn't expand into new states and territories. This led all of these factions to meet together in Aurora to figure out how to move forward. They no longer felt that the current political parties represented them, so they adopted the name Republican to describe themselves. This was not the first time the name was used to describe individuals who opposed the expansion of slavery. That actually occurred at a meeting about 6 months earlier in Ripon, Wisconsin. However, the Aurora Convention was about the third convention to adopt the name Republican, and so they really helped pave the way for the formation of the Republican Party when it organized in 1856, a couple years later. First Congregational Church would also host many anti-slavery speakers, and perhaps the most prominent was none other than Frederick Douglass. So just take a second to let that sink in. The Frederick Douglass, the famous orator and writer who powerfully drew on his experience of enslavement in Maryland to become a champion of abolitionism, visited Aurora. So we know that Douglass for sure spoke at First Congregational Church in 1854, and we have documentation to back that up. He may have also spoke at the church another time before then. John Farnsworth, who was a St. Louis or a St. Charles lawyer, stated years after the Civil War that Douglass persuaded him to become an abolitionist when he spoke at the church sometime in the 1840s or 50s. And it's definitely possible that that happened since Douglass traveled around the country speaking, but I can't find another source to corroborate that. But we do know for sure that Douglass's 1854 visit did occur. So it occurred on October 18th of 1854, just 1 month after the People's Convention that I just described. And actually next month will mark 170 years since Douglass's visit to Aurora. So on the day that he visited, he was supposed to debate the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act with Stephen Douglas, who was the famous pro-slavery senator from Illinois who actually helped draft the bill. However, on the day the debate was supposed to occur, both Douglasses arrived in Aurora sick. So Frederick Douglass recovered enough to speak, but Stephen Douglas did not. There's also some talk that he had just suffered a major political loss in Illinois, so that might be why he was sick. But can leave that up to debate. So Stephen Douglas asked to reschedule their debate to a few days later in Chicago, and Frederick agreed. However, Frederick Douglass decided to stay in Aurora to speak. So Douglass's speech at Aurora was documented in the local Aurora newspaper, the Aurora Guardian, but also Frederick Douglass's newspaper that he published in New York, which there's an image of on the screen as well. And also newspapers in Chicago, Springfield, and Milwaukee also reported on it. So First Congregational that evening was crowded to overflowing with local people interested to hear Douglass speak. Reportedly, there were even people looking in through the windows because there wasn't enough room inside. Despite still feeling a little sick, Douglass spoke eloquently for about a half hour before he had to take his seat, and Aurora residents were captivated by him. A Milwaukee newspaper stated that Douglass, quote, commanded the undivided attention of his audience, end quote. And one Aurora resident would recall later that, quote, those who heard him speak can never forget, end quote. No one described exactly what he spoke about, but he presumably criticized the Kansas-Nebraska Act and spoke in favor of abolishing slavery. After Douglass spoke, a man named Burke Chapman from Ohio, who apparently had traveled to Aurora to hear the Douglasses debate, took the pulpit and began speaking in defense of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and slavery, which greatly angered the audience in First Congregational Church. The Aurora Guardian reported that Burke Chapman, this man from Ohio, was a very poor speaker, that he dodged questions posed by the audience, and apparently kept speaking at length about, quote, the American Eagle, Star-Spangled Banner, and Texas, end quotes. He was eventually asked to stop speaking. He obviously could not live up to Douglas's eloquence and reasoning for fighting slavery. So I think it's really important to talk about Aurora's significant role in the abolitionist movement first, because it really helped explain why many Aurora residents broke the laws of their time to aid enslaved Black Americans escaping on the Underground Railroad. They believed slavery was a crime against humanity and God, and that those suffering under it needed to be free. So moving on to the Underground Railroad. So just a little background on it. So the Underground Railroad refers to the efforts of enslaved Black Americans to obtain their freedom from slavery through escape and flight. It really lasted from the beginning of American slavery through the end of the Civil War. And as long as people have been enslaved in North America, there have been those who escaped. Early on, it was to communities of other escaped Black Americans in remote locations. Eventually, as the United States developed and grew, enslaved Black Americans had to cross state and eventually international borders to find freedom. And the term that most historians now use to refer to the Black Americans who escaped slavery is freedom seeker, because that was really what they were doing. They were trying to find their freedom through the means that they were able to accomplish. Freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad were aided by a lot of different people. They're aided by free Black Americans, Native Americans, and also white Americans. Free Black Americans, many of whom were once in bondage, helped enslaved people obtain freedom since the beginning of slavery. And I think it's incredibly fitting that the historical figure person that we most often associate with the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman. She escaped slavery in Maryland in 1849 and then went back several times to free her family members and other enslaved people. She was very representative of many Black Americans who led Underground Railroad efforts. And this is a picture of Tubman from just after the Civil War, and it was actually only discovered in a photo album owned, I believe, by the Smithsonian or Library of Congress just a few years ago. So it's very newly discovered. Native Americans often opened their communities to those who escaped slavery as well, especially in Illinois before it became a state. And white Americans would begin helping people escape slavery on a large scale in the early 1800s, especially the Quakers. On the East Coast, they were probably the first group of white Americans to start aiding the Underground Railroad. And when talking about this topic, I always like to talk about a lot of myths related to the Underground Railroad, just because it's been so heavily mythologized in American culture, largely because it is really a truly remarkable story of individuals who escaped to free themselves and reclaim their humanity. However, there are some common myths and misconceptions about this movement that are important to address because they're untrue, and they also don't really do this historical story justice. I really believe that the facts speak for themselves. So the first myth is that most enslaved people were able to successfully escape on the Underground Railroad, which is unfortunately far from the case. Historians estimate that only about 45,000 individuals at most found freedom through the Underground Railroad. Some historians think as high as 100,000. But with either number, with the 45,000 number, this is only about 2.5% of the 3.9 million enslaved Americans in the United States in 1860. It was very challenging and risky for enslaved people to escape from their masters, and not everyone was willing or able to do it. Another myth is that all enslaved people on the Underground Railroad were kind of passively moved from safe house to safe house by white Americans. This myth kind of emerged in the late 19th century, and it's really far from the truth. Freedom seekers usually charted their own paths to freedom. The Underground Railroad was not directed by white Americans who decided that Black Americans needed to be free. It was directed by the freedom seekers who took securing their own freedom in their own hands. Freedom seekers often received aid periodically, but it was very risky to do that because they had to trust that a stranger that they encountered wouldn't turn them into the authorities, and many did not take the chance and get any aid. However, it did become more common for freedom seekers to receive aid as the Underground Railroad became more and more organized from the 1830s onward. So, two more myths I'll discuss. So a lot of people assume that all people, both Black and white, who identified as abolitionists before the Civil War were involved in the Underground Railroad, and this was not the case. The individuals who aided freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad were a small subset of abolitionists who not only called for the end of slavery, but were also willing to break the law to help those harmed by it. Aiding freedom seekers was illegal, and those who got caught doing so could face legal action and steep fines. So you had to really passionately believe in abolitionism to be involved in the Underground Railroad. And the last myth I'll address is the idea that most freedom seekers used secret passageways and hidden rooms in abolitionists' home on their path through Canada to freedom. And in reality, secret passageways and hidden room were not incredibly common. They're actually quite rare, likely because they were very costly to construct. Building underground tunnels was a whole feat of engineering in and of itself at the time. And also, they were just very time consuming to construct. So especially a lot of abolitionists, if they weren't doing this, or if they weren't aiding freedom seekers all the time, they likely didn't feel a need to. There are some exceptional cases. One that I can think of is the Levy Coffin House in Ohio, which has a secret room. But they were not the norm. And a lot of times freedom seekers usually were not able, that didn't necessarily need these types of things because they usually traveled at night under the cover of darkness. And they were also very skilled at hiding in the natural landscape using caves, forests, bodies of water to kind of hide from their pursuers. So in the 19th century, freedom seekers would escape from their masters in southern states and try to make it to a free state or territory, usually in the north. They sometimes would need to leave the country if they were being relentlessly pursued by slave catchers, which were bounty hunters hired by slaveholders to reclaim their fugitive slaves. But oftentimes, a freedom seeker could find safety and freedom without leaving the country. This would change drastically in 1850 when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. The law made it easy for masters to retrieve their slaves, even if they were in a free state, because it empowered federal marshals, which are essentially U.S. federal government law enforcement, to arrest and return enslaved people to their masters without a trial. A master just needed to testify that an individual was their property. The law also required state and local officials, as well as private individuals, to assist the federal marshals with capturing freedom seekers. So it was very, very strict law, very controversial. And the law further made aiding freedom seekers or obstructing their capture a crime punishable by a $1,000 fine, which roughly is about $35,000 in today's money, and also 6 months of prison time. So it was very, very harsh punishment if you got caught. So with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, freedom seekers now had to leave the country entirely to truly be free. The most common destination was Canada, as a lot of the routes on the map show. But a lot of people don't know that freedom seekers also found refuge by escaping to Mexico and the Caribbean, where slavery was illegal in Great Britain starting in 1833, and Canada was part of Britain. Mexico had abolished slavery after gaining independence from Spain, and many Caribbean countries did as well. So going to these places where slavery was illegal was a great shot to find freedom. They could also escape to territories in the West where it was easier to evade capture because it was less populated. And this map, created by the National Park Service, shows many of these documented routes that freedom seekers took throughout the countries. I think it is important to note that freedom seekers rarely kind of follow these set routes that these maps kind of lay out. They're more kind of just a general overview of all the routes they took. In reality, freedom seekers often had to change their route on the fly, double back sometimes to if they ran into a slave catcher or their master. And so it was really kind of constant movement. It wasn't a straight path. They had to follow a lot of different ways, really just depending on their situation. And but the routes shown on these maps are very useful because they kind of show the commonly traveled corridors that freedom seekers would follow. And freedom seekers took all sorts of methods. They went on foot. Sometimes they were able to secure passage on ships, sometimes on actual railroads after they became more popular. So it was a lot of different means to find freedom in this time period. So kind of moving into Illinois now. So in Illinois, the first residents of the state who participated in the Underground Railroad were free Black communities in the southern part of the state. They began doing this in about the 1820s. The free Black community in Chicago and white abolitionists throughout the state started aiding freedom seekers in the 1830s and 1840s. And by 1850, abolitionists had established a statewide, often interracial network to aid those escaping through Illinois. So this map that you see here is kind of the corridors of passage that existed at about 1850. So freedom seekers primarily entered the state from the slave states of Missouri and Kentucky, and also the free state of Iowa by crossing either the Mississippi River or the Ohio River. So Mississippi River, as you know, is on the west part of the state. The Ohio River is south. And there's really documentation that freedom seekers crossed over the Mississippi as far south in Cairo, Illinois, which is southern tip, all the way up to Galena, the northwest tip. So there was a lot of movement across the Mississippi really all along the Mississippi River. The Ohio River was less traveled, in part because really the southern part of Illinois at this time, it was largely settled by people from kind of North Carolina, Virginia, so slave states. And so those in southern Illinois were usually more in support of slavery, more willing to adhere to kind of fugitive slave laws at the time. And so really a lot of freedom seekers had to be very cautious in southern Illinois because of this. And also a lot of residents were also hostiles to Black Americans, whether they were free or they were enslaved. But once they got north of Springfield, a lot of freedom seekers stopped traveling by night and started traveling by day because they felt safer. Northern part of the state was much more in support of abolitionism and were less likely to report them to authorities. And really their main goal in getting to the state, as the map shows, is to get to Chicago. And that was because, and they really followed all types of ways. A major thoroughfare was the Illinois River, which kind of goes this direction. But they also followed major roads, kind of following along them just because it was a way to kind of track the direction they were going in. They followed rivers a lot of the time as well. In some cases, actual railroads. Once in Chicago, they needed to make it to Detroit, which was where they could easily cross over the border with Canada. And sometimes freedom seekers could secure passage to Detroit aboard a Great Lakes steamer in Chicago or boat. So they would go all the way up through the Great Lakes to Detroit and cross that way. And if they could not get that method, if they could not board a steamship in Chicago, they might go up to Wisconsin, to the port cities, Milwaukee. There's one documented incident in Green Bay where they were able to board a steamer there. And if they couldn't do that, they would travel by foot south of Chicago through northern Indiana and then southern Michigan to get to Detroit. So really kind of getting to Detroit was the goal because that's where they could easily get into Canada. So let's zoom in again to where Aurora was situated on Underground Railroad routes. So freedom seekers usually enter northeastern Illinois by following the Illinois River, as I mentioned, which was down here. And then a lot of times they would take the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which went straight to Chicago. But there was another option they could take at Ottawa on the Illinois River. They could follow the Fox River up northeast. So they often followed the Fox River northeast until they reached Aurora. Along the way, they might have gotten assistance from abolitionists in Salmonaught and Yorkville, which were pretty well documented Underground Railroad locations. And then at Aurora, Underground Railroad conductors would transport or direct the freedom seekers eastward to Chicago, following a well-traveled plank road that roughly correlates today with Ogden Avenue through kind of Aurora and Naperville going east. The freedom seekers might also receive assistance from abolitionists in Downers Grove, or Downers Grove is here, and then Hinsdale as well. And Downers Grove is where the Blodgett House was, which kind of got me interested in the Underground Railroad. And that's through that research, it led me to Aurora, which I'll get talked about in a moment. Freedom seekers could also go around or through Aurora north to other towns along the Fox River. St. Charles, Elgin, and Dundee all had active Underground Railroad participants. Freedom seekers could also arrive in the Fox River Valley by traveling from the west through DeKalb County from the western part of the state, kind of around Rock Island, going through Ogle County and other places along that way. And from there, they would usually go east to Chicago there were stops in Wheaton and Lombard that were pretty significant, and eventually make it to Chicago from there. If they didn't go through Chicago, they might go from kind of, especially in the northern towns on the Fox River, Dundee and Elgin, they might go north to the Lake Michigan shoreline that way, or they might go even farther north into Wisconsin. And yeah, so that was kind of the main paths of movement in this time period. So Aurora residents became active in the Underground Railroad, most likely during the 1840s, when abolitionists in the state were becoming more organized politically through the Liberty Party. We know that they were for sure participating by the 1850s because Aurora newspapers openly wrote about it. So in December of 1854, the Aurora Guardian published a very revealing article. In it, they wrote, quote, "We learned that 17 passengers passed through this place on Monday by the Underground Railroad, and we saw one solitary and alone making for the depot about car time on Tuesday in open daylight. The Chicago papers announced their arrival in that city and say they were immediately forwarded to the land of the free." End quote. The depot mentioned in this article was likely First Congregational Church, and I'll explain why in a moment. But they were very openly writing about it, in both Aurora and also Chicago. And this was in part because of how high sympathy for these freedom seekers and abolitionists, just how many people in this area supported it. So this article goes on to state, to make this statement, which is, quote, "It seems that the fugitive slave law is in full force in Illinois. We don't mean the one passed at Washington, but the other one passed by the people, that if slave owners want their runaway slaves catched, they can do it themselves." This article is really telling of just how supportive Aurora residents were to the Underground Railroad. So first off, the newspaper is openly reporting that Aurora residents are participating in the Underground Railroad, aiding freedom seekers, which shows they weren't very concerned that their readers or local law enforcement would try to stop it. They also assumed that enough of their readership was in support of the Underground Railroad. And another thing that this article is doing is that they're informing Aurora residents who aided these freedom seekers that made their way successfully to Chicago, that to really tell them that they made it safely. And so it's celebratory in that matter. And then really the sentiment about the fugitive slave law is really just adding to that. It really expresses the sentiment that a lot of Aurora residents shared, that we aren't going to follow the fugitive slave law because we don't agree with it. And this article also strongly illustrates that Aurora residents were comfortable with breaking the law to aid freedom seekers because they believed it was the right thing to do. So it was very common, as I mentioned, for free Black communities in Illinois to aid freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad, as many were formerly enslaved themselves and understood the injustices of slavery. There were large free Black communities in Chicago and in Southern Illinois, and freedom seekers were sometimes able to join these communities and basically hide in plain sight. It's possible that the few free Black Americans who lived in Aurora before the Civil War also aided freedom seekers as they passed through town. So we unfortunately don't have a lot of documentation of Aurora's free Black community before the Civil War. The 1850 census lists 2 Black residents in town, a woman named Phoebe and her 1-year-old son who lived with a white family. In the 1860 census, or right before the Civil War would start, there were 2 Black families living in Aurora, the Gilmans and the Demarys, and so making for a total of 14 Black residents. However, censuses can be a little unreliable because they only list who lived in Aurora every 10 years. So we don't know if there are other people living in between those time periods. And also not everyone was counted. The censuses would definitely not have counted any freedom seekers who stayed in Aurora for more than a short time. And one freedom seeker we know stayed in Aurora was a man named Jerry, because of this article written in the Aurora Guardian in 1853. So they mentioned that Jerry had lived in town for many years, but one day he disappeared suddenly, and a rumor started to spread that he had been captured by a slave catcher. However, this article says with certainty that Jerry left town on the Underground Railroad. They must have had an inside informant. And the article speculates that Jerry likely feared that his master or slave catchers were going to find him and decided to take the last step and get to Canada. And this was actually something that many freedom seekers who stayed in free Black communities in Illinois did after the fugitive slave law was passed, because they were very spooked by it and did not want to go back to slavery. And so it's very possible that this small Black community in Aurora of both free Black individuals and those seeking freedom aided freedom seekers who passed through town. It's very likely that they did, but we unfortunately just don't have a lot of concrete information about their involvement. So now we'll return again to First Congregational Church of Aurora, which, in addition to being the center of abolitionism, was also the center of the Underground Railroad. So Reverend David Miller, who I discussed at the beginning of this presentation, recalled in an 1888 letter how the church participated in the Underground Railroad when he was pastor from 1849 to 1852. Miller wrote that the First Congregational Church was the Union Depot of the Underground Railroad in Aurora, so suggesting that it had a very significant role. And he also mentions in his letter that Aurora was so well known that slaveholders and slave catchers knew the church was involved, so they knew that that might be a place to look if they were searching for someone. Several members of the church gave aid to freedom seekers in their home and helped guide them to Chicago. And Reverend Miller's letter really implies that kind of a lot of the church members worked collectively together. In this story, or in this letter, Miller recalls 2 specific stories of the church's involvement, which are both really interesting. So in the first story, he tells how an enslaved woman who was on the brink of starvation came to his house. The woman shared with him how she and her husband had been fleeing for their freedom, but were seen by their master and got separated while running through their lives. She had wandered around in the woods trying to find her husband for several days, but eventually gave up and kept on moving towards Chicago. So Miller enlisted the help of a member of the church, a man named Brother Baker. I haven't exactly been able to find who exactly that was. Need to do a little more research. But he basically had the woman, gave the woman to this man. He put her on the back of a horse, and they went to an Underground Railroad station in Downers Grove, likely the Blodgett House, but it doesn't say for sure. And so later that night, a light-skinned man came to Reverend Miller's door and inquired after an enslaved woman. Miller thought that the man was her master, and so he invited him inside to learn more, to try to potentially help maybe persuade him or kind of basically get him off her path. But he eventually realized that the man was her husband because the man started to weep at the thought of not seeing his wife again. And so Miller immediately took him to the station in Downers Grove, even though it was late at night, to make sure that he got there before, make sure the husband got there before his wife moved on to Chicago. Thus, Miller was able to successfully reunite the couple. And there's actually a very similar story from Downers Grove as well that might be the same story, but basically the premise is pretty much the same. So the second major story that Reverend Miller shared in this letter was the one I actually told you about at the beginning of the presentation, where he and his wife hid a group of freedom seekers in a wagon to transport them secretly to Chicago. And there's actually a little bit more to the story once they got to Chicago that I wanted to share. So once Miller arrived in Chicago, he went to the home of Philo Carpenter, who was a noted Underground Railroad participant. He was also a Congregationalist, and he actually owned a farm on land that's now owned by Fermilab in DuPage County. So he had a pretty good connection to this area. So the church likely worked with him often. But on this day Miller arrived, Carpenter was not at home, and his wife, Anne, told Miller that the Chicago was kind of in a frenzy because many slaveholders had arrived in the city and hired men to watch known Underground Railroad sites to apprehend their slaves. Miller had the since Carpenter wasn't there, Miller had the freedom seekers hide in a small attic at the Carpenter house that they used to access their chimney, and he went to find Philo Carpenter. Carpenter was unfortunately not able to help him at the time. He just couldn't think of a way to kind of get the freedom seekers safely out of the city. So Miller turned to Louis Isbell, who was a noted free Black Underground Railroad participant in the city, who worked as a barber in one of the main hotels. Isbell organized a group of free Black citizens of Chicago who devised a plan with Miller to help the freedom seekers board a lumber ship that was bound for Michigan. And so the next day, a group of 40 free Black men from Chicago came armed to Philo Carpenter's house and scared off the men who were watching the house for the slaveholders. The freedom seekers Miller had brought to Aurora then boarded a carriage hidden and went to the lumber warehouse where the ship was docked. They timed it so at lunchtime, while everyone was inside eating, Miller and the others carried the freedom seekers in bags onto the ship, and they left them on the ship, and they were able to get to Michigan and cross the border into Canada. And this story is really powerful because it really shows how abolitionists, both white and Black, in the Chicago region worked together to help enslaved people secure their freedom. And it's a really good example of how the Underground Railroad worked, not just focusing on Aurora, but really looking at the regional perspective. While Reverend Miller was the pastor of First Congregational Church, the church would pass probably one of its most radical resolutions against slavery. So after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in Congress in 1850, the congregation was outraged, understandably, and they passed a set of resolutions, including that we cannot consent to carry out the principles of the Fugitive Slave Act without violating our Christian principles and profession. So very similar to the article in the Aurora Guardian, they did not agree with the law. But they further resolved that, quote, the panting fugitive fleeing from oppression has our deepest sympathies, and that we consider it to be our Christian duty to assist him in all peaceable ways to make his escape. And so, like others in Aurora, First Congregational Church made their support of the Underground Railroad very publicly known. And the church likely continued participating in the Underground Railroad through the end of the Civil War, possibly at their new location. There are also some articles I found from after the Civil War that state that the members of Park Place Baptist Church who moved to First Congregational's original location also helped with the Underground Railroad. And it's very likely that they did, especially since the church building was already known to be connected. But I haven't been able to find a ton more information on that. So moving on to some specific participants in the region. So William Strong was a significant Aurora Underground Railroad participant who was connected with the First Congregational Church. He was actually one of the two men who organized the meeting at which the church was founded in 1838. And he would go on to serve as a deacon of the church for many years. Deacons were spiritual and governing leaders of congregational churches at the time. Strong was born in New York State and settled with his wife Carolyn and family in the vicinity of Naperville in 1834, which was the same year that the McCarty brothers, who founded Aurora, settled east of Stope Island. Strong's homestead was located 4 miles east of Stope Island on what is today New York Street, just east of Eola Road. This photo shows his brick house that he built on his property, likely in the 1840s or 50s, and this photo is from when it was still standing in the 1980s. I believe it's since been demolished. And despite not living in Aurora, within the city limits, he still considered himself a resident of Aurora since he was involved with the church. And he would actually later move into town in 1858 and sell his farm to his son. Strong was a very devoted abolitionist who became active in the Liberty Party. He was known to organize meetings with other members of First Congregational Church where they would pray for the end of slavery. And with such a passion for abolitionism, Strong also participated in the Underground Railroad. The two main sources we have verifying his involvement are his obituary in a Chicago newspaper when he passed away, and a 1928 interview with his grandson, Mervyn Strong. However, these sources don't provide a ton of details about his involvement. They're more kind of brief mentions. His grandson did state that Strong helped transport freedom seekers from the home of John Wagner on the west side of the Aurora to the home of Israel Blodgett in Downers Grove. So that's the first time someone specifically says that. And Strong also likely worked with other members of First Congregational Church. His wife, Carolyn, was also probably very involved, providing food and clothing. A lot of the wives of Underground Railroad participants are kind of unsung heroes of the movement, as they were the ones cooking the meals and making sure that the freedom seekers felt comfortable in their homes. So John Wagner and his wife, Laura, were perhaps the most active Underground Railroad participants in Aurora who weren't associated with First Congregational Church. John Wagner and his wife Laura and children traveled from New York State to Aurora in 1837. They originally lived in a log cabin on the east side of the river. And a few years later, they purchased land on the west side, and John established a dairy farm. The farm was located on the Fox River, close to the intersection of Lake and Prairie Streets, if you know where that is. The Wagners are very interesting because there's not a lot of detailed information about them that was recorded in the historical record. It's actually quite bizarre from what I found in researching other early residents of Aurora. We know that John was an abolitionist and that he subscribed to the Western Citizen. He's in the subscriber books that I mentioned at the Chicago Museum. And it's very interesting. So in this family portrait that he commissioned around 1846, he's holding a newspaper. And if you look really closely, you see the words Liberty and Citizen. So the Western Citizen's tagline was often devoted to universal liberty. So this is very clearly kind of a subtle nod to his abolitionism. And the person who actually painted the portrait was a man named Sheldon Peck, who was a portrait artist who lived in what is today Lombard. And Peck was also an ardent abolitionist and also an Underground Railroad participant. So Wagner clearly knew other abolitionists in the area. And his support, one other thing is I've not really been able to find any information about which denomination the Wagners belong to. They don't appear on First Congregational's list of members that was released in the late 19th century. So they weren't connected to the movement in that way, but there were many denominations of the time in Illinois were in support of abolitionism. So though we don't know much about the Wagners personally, there is definitely a lot of information about their involvement in the Underground Railroad. So John and Laura's daughter, Maria Wagner Messenger, would recall near the end of her life in 1925 that her family aided freedom seekers. She specifically remembered waking up during the middle of the night to help cook meals for the freedom seekers who came to their home. So Julia Pringle, I might pronounce that wrong, was a granddaughter of John and Laura. She recalled a couple years later how her grandparents aided freedom seekers. She shared that John and Laura taught their children to treat freedom seekers with respect and called them gentlemen of color instead of any other term. And both Maria and Julia recalled that their father and grandfather transported freedom seekers to a house on New York Street towards Naperville, likely referring to William Strong's house. Maria recalled that her father was never suspected or troubled in any way for his participation, so he was able to kind of do this work without anyone kind of protesting. The Wagners' neighbors also noticed what was going on at the house. In 1896, a man named John King wrote a letter to an Underground Railroad scholar, and he said in this letter that he remembered seeing many people of color of both sexes stopping at the Wagners' farmhouse for short or long periods of time and then disappearing. And he wrote, quote, "It was well understood that these guests were fugitives from the South," end quote. So this really seems to suggest that the Wagners' involvement was very much open secret. People knew about it, but they just didn't really talk about it. There was also one other neighbor of the Wagners who recalled that as a boy, he ran into freedom seekers on the west, to the west of Aurora, who asked him for directions to the Wagner house. And as many of you probably know, there is a house that was built by the Wagners at Blackberry Farm. But there's actually a lot of ambiguity about the house's history. We definitely know it was built by the Wagners and it was on their property, but it's unclear if they ever used it as their main residence. So because of that, it's hard to say for certain if they used that structure during the Underground Railroad work, but it's definitely possible. They likely built the house for laborers or to rent out to people moving to Aurora. So the last participant that I'll talk about in depth was a man named Ira Fitch. So Ira and his wife Felina arrived in Illinois in 1837, and they originally settled in a community to the west of Aurora and south of Sugar Grove called Jericho. Jericho Road in Aurora is the street that went to that town. So he actually would later move to Aurora in 1852, and he entered the hardware and leather business, opening a store. And he also became the first president of the First National Bank of Aurora when it was established right before the Civil War broke out. He built a house on the east side of Aurora along the river near Pierce Street. And this is actually really interesting. It's a copper token that has shown up on, a couple of examples have showed up on the antique market. And so he likely made this coin. It's dated to 1861. So it's possible it was maybe a form of currency for people shopping at a store, or it was just to commemorate the beginning of the war. But while in Jericho, Fitch worked with two of his neighbors, a man named Thomas Pierce and Ezekiel Mikos, who were his neighbors to aid freedom seekers. So according to Fitch's wife, Felina, later in her life, Pierce and Mikos would secret and provide aid to freedom seekers in Jericho, and then they would have Fitch take them to Chicago because he had the fastest team of horses in the area. Fitch would often have female freedom seekers wear black veils, like Reverend Miller did, and then would often hide the male freedom seekers in the back of his wagon and cover them with merchandise or produce. This was very common in the area. And apparently Fitch was hotly pursued by slave catchers while transporting freedom seekers to Chicago. It was told that to shake these people off his tail, he would race ahead of them with his fast horses and turn onto a crossroad until they passed. So don't know if that's an exaggeration or not, but it is a very cool story. And so it's very probable that Fitch continued participating in the Underground Railroad after moving to Aurora and continued his efforts. So there's just a few other participants in Aurora that I wanted to mention that I discovered during my research. So William Hawkins and Curtis Osborne. So Hawkins was a railroad agent who lived in Aurora. Curtis Osborne was a painter. And Curtis Osborne's daughter recalled in 1929 that she remembered one day William Hawkins or W.H. Hawkins dropped off a freedom seeker at their home because he was housing too many at his own residence. And so Osborne hid the freedom seeker in his cellar, and the following day placed the enslaved men in the back of his wagon and stacked lumber around the man. He was a painter and also engaged in lumber, so he probably had a lot to use, and it wouldn't be weird for him to be traveling around carting lumber. And Osborne then transported the seeker to another station. His daughter doesn't say which one. And then one last person I'll mention is a man named Thompson Paxton, who was a farmer who lived just over the county border in DuPage along Eola Road. He technically lived in a small settlement called Big Woods at the corner of Eola and Butterfield Roads. Today, there's Big Woods Church, the Big Woods Church building and cemetery, which are there, which are kind of the only remnants of the town. But his farm was within the city limits of Aurora today, as they exist today. And his property was likely right along where I-88 is built right now. He was also a Congregationalist. He was active in local abolitionist politics with his 4 adult sons. And he also aided freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad at his farm. And Paxton is really interesting because he's one of the only Underground Railroad participants in Northeastern Illinois who grew up in the South. He was born in Virginia and lived in Tennessee before coming to Illinois. And so he really most likely saw the horrors of slavery firsthand, and that's likely what motivated him to become an abolitionist and participate in the Underground Railroad. And he's one of the few conductors that we have a picture of as well. And there were likely others in Aurora who participated as well, and further research may definitely uncover more. There's always more research to do. And kind of with that, I want to thank you so much for having me this evening. And I'm happy to take a few questions if we have time, Colleen. Yeah.
When did that come along?
Yes, so New England Congregational, I think it was established in the 1850s, and it was a group of members from First Congregational who wanted to form a church on the west side of the river. And so they kind of peacefully broke off. And yeah, I'm not quite sure. I haven't found much evidence if they were participating at all, but if they were former members of the other church, it's likely that they could have worked in partnership as well. Yeah.
Why did it take so long for them to find this information? Because here, here in Aurora, now they've abolished all these things. That's the thing.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the best articles about the Underground Railroad in Aurora was written in the 1830s by Lutz White, who was a history columnist. And so he really kind of helped preserve the history, but then after that, a lot of it just, I think, got lost or just people didn't really know about it. Dennis Buck in his book does talk about a lot of this history, including that Frederick Douglass came, but I'm kind of surprised a lot more people don't know about kind of this history.
I'm from Ringo, Illinois, so it's only about a half an hour up into Wisconsin. So, you have them to Woodstock and you can go straight up. So that's basically the issue. So, the interesting in Route 20 is the biggest highway in the state. So that's another issue too.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I didn't.
Good.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
That's question just a comment.
Yeah.
Coolest experiences my husband and I ever had. We were at Harriet Tubman's house in New York State. And we got to meet descendants of hers through her brother's family.
Oh, wow.
And that was the first time they had ever been to that house too. So it was like this neat experience.
Ooh, that's incredible.
Even though it's, it's a documentary, maybe not all of it true because it's Hollywood. but if anyone has seen that movie of Harriet.
Oh, yeah.
It is an amazing movie to see because it will tell you how many slaves she had gotten into Canada and her family and how she became a conductor as well. So we rent it out at the library or something like that and watch it if you have not seen it because by going to Michigan and seeing the house that we were in, there at the Bonine House, it was pretty awesome to see it. And they also have a picture of her in there in the house, which now I can't find in my phone, but it's there. And it does have about the Fugitive Slavery Act in there in that house.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great research done on her in recent years, including that she was a spy in the Union Army, which a lot of people don't
Right.
know either.
Yeah, she was playing and still did this work in the Civil War. As well as they did find somebody, now they said this on the news, so, she's from Texas and she took people, I don't remember her name. So I'll do research on it. But she took people, like the one that took people to Mexico. So they just found that out. I can't remember her name now.
Thank you.
Also, many years ago, we took a bus tour with Lynette Tilly Turner,
Oh, yeah.
and she would take you to places up in the northern suburbs that were part of the Underground Railroad. It was really interesting. It was interesting because my mother was the one that wanted to go initially.
Yeah.
We really-
Yeah, Glenette is great, and I highly recommend all of her books. They're
Yeah,
really
yeah.
good. Yeah.
What was your favorite piece of information that you learned in preparing this presentation?
Yeah, probably just the story of Reverend Miller and that he was working so closely with, and that there's just such detailed information about him working so closely with conductors in Chicago and in the free Black community there. It's just such an incredible piece of, or such an incredible document to have, and I'm really glad that it's preserved in the Aurora Historical Society.
Thought you said that the Reverend was only there from 44 to 52.
Mhm.
Who followed him? Because 52 was still an active time.
Yeah.
60s.
Yeah, they had a couple of different abolitionist preachers. I only know about 3 of them that were identified specifically, but it's likely that even though they had a different pastor, they still continued to participate and that they probably had similar beliefs. Because I really think you see the continuity too with their resolution in the 40s, moving up into the 50s. So yeah, it's likely that no matter who their pastor was, they were still
So
involved.
that wasn't as famous.
Yeah, yeah,
The other.
definitely.
Are there descendants of these families still living in Aurora?
I'm not very sure. Yeah, I know we have some genealogy volunteers who might be able to help you.
I saw some rather familiar surnames as your
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah, it'd be very cool to find people.
Where did this whole railroad connection come from? In other words, what, the extent you have documents.
Yeah, so yeah, it really is interesting. It's kind of like a coded like language that they used. Railroads were really popular in the 1840s, 1830s. And so a lot of times they used it as kind of a metaphor in that kind of these freedom seekers were moving so quickly, they were barely seen that they were like as fast as a train. And so that's kind of where that language came from. And you can kind of see with the Aurora Guardian article that they're kind of almost playfully using it to kind of to basically state what's going on, but kind of conceal it using kind of this language. So it really was just kind of this code that they use to kind of communicate.
Speaking of code, there was a speaker here, I'd say 3 months ago or so, who was talking about Negro spirituals.
Oh yeah.
How they contain the code about the Underground Railroad, and he was telling people who were listening and hearing when the next movement was going to be, or what time, speaking of, it speak of time of the day, it was really time when you were supposed to be at the corner of getting out.
Yeah, definitely very important.
Listen to that.
No specific mentions in the sources, but the sources are they kind of don't have a ton of information in them to begin with, so you kind of have to really read it very closely and delve in. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any stories of specific freedom seekers who traveled through Aurora. There's one very noted one named Carolyn Quarles who kind of moved through this area from Wisconsin. She stopped at Elgin, she stopped in Warrenville, but she kind of circumvented Aurora. And yeah, I really wish we had more of those stories, but just with the nature of slavery and that these people were moving through town so quickly, a lot of their stories weren't documented.
Yeah, so one of the things that that brings up the concept of spirituals being used as a coding communication. I imagine that information would change. So there wouldn't necessarily be a documentation of spirituals being reported because the whole point is it's a secret message.
Yeah.
So if it's true, then that would likely disavow the idea that there would be documentation of it. But I know there's some information about the quilts.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna mention.
Yes.
I was gonna mention that.
Yeah, no, the quilts, there was some pretty good books. There's a lot of kind of family stories from a lot of descendants of freedom seekers about that. I don't know the book off the top of my head, but yeah, it is a very interesting history there. But again, it kind of wasn't nothing like super specific like that was documented at the time, or at least in Aurora.
At least what I was gonna mention is the Michigan, saw that, the Bonnie House is what they had, is like I mentioned, is they had the quilts there. And basically, they would have to find the pattern, right, of
Yeah.
what they had to follow on that quilt. And especially with Harriet, she couldn't read, and they also in that house, it said what they had to follow, they had to follow the North Star. So keep following that North Star and you will get to where you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the big things with some of these, slaves were trying to get away. They couldn't read. So that's how come the quilts came in handy way. If they could follow the paths, then they could follow where they were going.
Yeah, and
If anybody wants to see a picture of a quilt, I've done them in my.
yeah, we actually do have a neighbor too. I believe her name is Connie Martin, but she does a really good presentation with examples of all the different quilts and ties it to her family history as well. It's really good. I think the city has had her as well, or has had her give a talk. So, yeah, she'd be a great resource.
This has nothing to do with the Underground Railroad, but I'm so proud of my dad. My mom went to Louisiana to marry him in 1944, just before he shipped off to Europe. And they were waiting to get on a bus. They got on a bus, and a very pregnant Black woman got on. And they were sitting, my dad and mom were in the front of the bus, and my dad got up to let her have a seat. And the bus driver said, no, she can't sit there. And my dad kept vociferously arguing with him. My dad and my mother got kicked off of the bus along with the poor lady that was pregnant. But I never heard that story from him. I heard it through some of my other family, because he didn't talk about that stuff. But how cool was that?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions as well. And I have my email up here at Aurora University. You can also look me up and I'll probably pop up on the college's web or the university's website. So yeah, thank you again.